In 1945, German soldiers didn't just fear American tanks. They didn't panic at the sight of British units either. But when they heard one name whispered on the front lines, they prepared for the fight of their lives. That name was the 5th Canadian Armoured Division. Why? Because these guys were different. They weren't just soldiers. They were relentless fighters who earned the nickname the mighty Maroon Machine. From the brutal mountains of Italy to the final push into the Netherlands, they spearheaded some of the toughest battles of the war. They were known for their aggressive tactics and sheer determination, often breaking through German lines where others had failed. The Germans knew that facing the 5th Canadian Armoured meant they were up against an unstoppable force, a unit that simply would not quit. Their legacy is a testament to incredible courage and skill. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories. In the final year of World War II, as Nazi Germany struggled to survive on multiple collapsing fronts, one Allied formation began to earn a terrifying reputation among German troops. Not American, not British, but Canadian. The 5th Canadian Armoured Division was not just another tank division. 2 German soldiers in Italy and Northwest Europe, they became a symbol of relentless pressure, sudden violence, and zero hesitation. But why? Why did German war diaries, prisoners, and frontline reports express such intense fear of and hatred toward this Canadian unit? To understand this, we must go back to the years 1943 to 1945, when the 5th Canadian Armoured Division truly entered the war and carved out its brutal legacy. The 5th Canadian Armoured Division was formed later than many other Allied units, and that delay ended up shaping everything about them. These soldiers had spent years watching earlier battles from the sidelines. They studied the failures of others, learned from the mistakes made at Dieppe in North Africa, and internalized the harsh lessons of modern warfare. When they finally entered combat, they were not just better prepared. They were far more aggressive, unlike some early war Allied forces that were still adapting to the pace of blitzkrieg. The 5th Canadian Armoured Division was specifically trained for fast, mobile warfare. They drilled relentlessly on rapid breakthroughs and, most importantly, on the seamless cooperation between tanks, infantry, and artillery. This was the alarms doctrine perfected. German troops on the front lines quickly noticed something unusual and deeply unsettling about their new opponents. When the Canadians attacked, they did not stop after securing the first objective. Conventional tactics often called for a pause to consolidate gains, but the Canadians kept pushing. They exploited every opening, relentlessly pursuing retreating forces and giving them no time to regroup or establish new defensive lines. This continuous forward momentum was a core part of their identity. They were not just taking ground, they were systematically dismantling the enemy's ability to fight back. This aggression wasn't reckless. It was a calculated doctrine designed to break the enemy's will. In 1943, the division was sent to Italy, a battlefield that was widely considered a nightmare for armored warfare. The Italian peninsula was a fortress of mountains, deep river valleys, and ancient stone villages that could be turned into deadly points. It was here, in this unforgiving terrain, that the 5th Canadian Armoured Division truly earned its formidable reputation. German units, masters of defensive warfare, expected Allied tanks to struggle and become bogged down. They believed the mountains were their allies. But the Canadian armor appeared in places it simply shouldn't have been able to operate. They navigated treacherous mountain passes and forded rivers that were thought to be impassable for heavy vehicles. They mastered the art of the unexpected. They attacked at night, a time when armored assaults were rare and incredibly difficult to coordinate. They forced river crossings directly under enemy fire, refusing to be pinned down. Instead of carefully bypassing heavily fortified villages, they often smashed straight through them, using the sheer shock and violence of their armored columns to shatter the defenses. German battlefield reports from this period frequently described the Canadian armored attacks as unpredictable and brutally persistent. A captured German officer reportedly said that fighting the Canadians was like fighting a shadow that suddenly materialized with the force of a battering ram. When the Canadians attacked, they did not disengage easily. The fight was to the finish. At the Moro River, and later in the grueling battle for the Liri Valley, which opened the road to Rome, German defenders learned this hard lesson firsthand. These were not just battles, they were meat grinders. But the Canadians had refined their methods into a deadly science. They coordinated artillery, tanks, and infantry with a precision that left German defenders overwhelmed. Massive rolling barrages would precede an attack, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. Then, just as the shelling lifted, the Sherman tanks of the 5th Division would be right on top of them. Machine guns blazing, with infantry advancing just behind to mop up any remaining resistance. If a German anti-tank gun managed to knock out a Canadian tank, another would move up to take its place almost immediately. There was no pause, no hesitation, no moment of respite for the defenders. The attacks simply kept coming, wave after wave. German soldiers who survived these assaults later described the experience as feeling like being slowly and systematically crushed by machinery. It felt cold, impersonal, and completely unstoppable. This wasn't just courage, it was a terrifyingly efficient system of destruction, and the Germans were on the receiving end. One German report lamented that the Canadians seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of shells and men. This is where the fear began to morph into something deeper: hatred. In war, hatred is often born from a sense of helplessness and terror. German troops began to associate the maple leaf insignia with this non-stop grinding pressure. The Canadians fought with a ferocity that was shocking even to veteran German units. But it wasn't just their attacks, it was their defense. They held the ground they took with absolute tenacity. German counterattacks, which were often successful against other Allied units, would break against the Canadian lines, like waves against a cliff. The Canadians would dig in, zero their mortar, and meet any counterthrust with overwhelming firepower. By 1944, German intelligence assessments had a clear warning. If the 5th Canadian Armoured Division was identified on your front, you were in for the fight of your life. The expectation was no longer about holding the line, but about how long you could survive before being overrun. For the German soldier in Italy, and later in Northwest Europe, the arrival of the Canadians meant one thing: the front line would not hold. They were seen not just as soldiers, but as a relentless force of nature that brought with it the certainty of violent combat and inevitable defeat. After the brutal fighting in Italy, the division was transferred to Northwest Europe in early 1945 to take part in the final push into Germany. Here on the flat plains of the Netherlands and northern Germany, their style of fast, mobile warfare was even more effective. They were instrumental in the liberation of the Netherlands, where they are still revered today. But here, too, their reputation for aggression followed them. In the final desperate days of the war, they met fierce resistance from die-hard German units, but the outcome was always the same. The Canadians pushed forward, smashing through defenses and liberating town after town. The 5th Canadian Armoured Division's story is a powerful reminder that reputation in war is earned in blood and fire. They were feared because they were effective. They were hated because they were relentless. They started the war as an unknown quantity and ended it as one of the most respected and feared armored formations in the Allied Army. Their legacy is not just one of victory, but of a unique and terrifying efficiency that left a deep and lasting impression on their enemies. When the final German surrender came, the men of the 5th had fought their way across two of the toughest fronts of the war, leaving behind a trail of defeated German divisions and a reputation that echoes in history. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this piece of history interesting, please consider liking this video. In the final brutal months of World War II, a strange kind of fear began to spread through the ranks of the German army in Northwest Europe. It wasn't just the fear of bombs or bullets, it was the fear of a particular sound, a particular sight, the steady, grinding advance of Canadian tanks. This is the story of how the 5th Canadian Armoured Division earned a reputation that became as powerful as any weapon they carried. By early 1945, the war was turning decisively in the Allies' favor. As Allied armies pushed deeper into German-held territory, the 5th Canadian Armoured Division was at the forefront of the assault. The German defenses, though still capable of putting up a fight, were beginning to crumble. But the Canadians gave them no breathing room, no chance to regroup. Allied strategy often called for consolidating gains after a breakthrough, allowing supply lines to catch up. The Canadians, however, had a different approach. They exploited every opening with blistering speed. They would punch through a line and just keep going, cutting supply routes, encircling retreating formations, and creating chaos deep behind enemy lines. German commanders, in their reports, expressed a kind of frustrated disbelief. They noted that the Canadian armored units seemed to ignore conventional wisdom, pushing forward relentlessly even when their own logistics were stretched thin. This wasn't recklessness, it was a calculated strategy of momentum. They understood that stopping meant giving the enemy a chance to recover, so they never stopped. At this late stage of the war, the battle was as much psychological as it was physical. Years of intense combat had taken their toll. Morale was a fragile commodity, and the Canadians seemed to have a unique talent for shattering it. A remarkable phenomenon began to occur. German soldiers, who might have fought fiercely against other units, would surrender almost immediately upon realizing they were facing Canadian armor. So what was it about them? It wasn't about flashy tactics or grand heroic charges. It was something far more unnerving. Their sheer, methodical relentlessness. Their advance was like a force of nature, steady, crushing, unstoppable tide. For German troops who were exhausted, demoralized, and often cut off from support, this wasn't just another attack. It felt inevitable. Facing a chaotic, unpredictable enemy might inspire a desperate last stand. But facing an enemy that moved with the cold certainty of a machine felt like staring into the face of destiny itself, and that destiny was defeat. Before the war, the international image of Canadians was often one of politeness, quiet reservation, and a calm demeanor. The crucible of war, however, forged a very different reputation. In post-war interviews and memoirs, German veterans revealed something that might seem surprising. They often described Canadian soldiers as fighting without the overt emotional displays common in the heat of battle. There was no theatrical rage, no panicked shouting. Instead, they observed a cold, focused determination. This lack of emotion, this calm aggression, was profoundly unsettling to their opponents. It suggested that the fighting wasn't personal. It was simply a job that had to be done, and they were going to do it with maximum efficiency. One captured German officer famously remarked that fighting the Canadians felt like facing men who had already decided the outcome. They fought as if victory was a foregone conclusion, and their role was simply to carry out the sentence. This created an aura of invincibility that was incredibly difficult to fight against. By the spring of 1945, the 5th Canadian Armoured Division had become more than just a military formation. It was a psychological weapon. Its reputation preceded it on the battlefield. German units tasked with holding the line against them often did so with a sense of dread and futility. They expected to be overrun. They expected to be outmaneuvered. And in the self-fulfilling prophecy of warfare, that expectation often became reality. This is why the Germans didn't just fear the Canadians. They developed a deep-seated resentment for them. In their eyes, the Canadians weren't just soldiers. They were the embodiment of the end. Their disciplined, unending advance was a constant physical reminder that the war was lost and their world was collapsing. Every rumble of a Canadian tank on the horizon signaled the inevitable conclusion they had fought so hard to deny. The story of the 5th Canadian Armoured Division in 1945 is one of mindless aggression or brutality for its own sake. It's a testament to the power of discipline, relentless pressure, and a clear-eyed understanding of what it took to win.